We'll get started momentarily. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to WTO's 5th session, meeting with candidates to be Director General of the WTO. We're delighted you could join us today, and we're pleased to welcome today's guest, Mohammed Maziad Al-Tuwaijri of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Before we get into today's program, we'd like to welcome all of you and call out a few of the names of the people who you are in community with watching this event today on Zoom, even if you can't see their faces. So welcome today to Carl Dahlgren with the Washington State Department of Commerce, Rachel McKnight with Sycamore Strategies, Jackie Northam with National Public Radio, and Josh Meltzer with the Brookings Institution. Welcome, Carl, Rachel, Jackie, Josh, and welcome to all of you. This is actually our 27th webinar since March, and we have 2 more scheduled with DG candidates in the days to come. Tomorrow at 11 a.m. with Ambassador Amina Mohammed of Kenya, and on Tuesday, August 11th, this coming Tuesday at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time with Korean Trade Minister Yoo Myung-hee. We're also going to be reaching out to the Moldovan candidate and hope to have him on a webinar in August as well. For today, if you're watching on Zoom, you have the ability to ask questions using the Q&A tab on Zoom. Please post questions there, and we'll try to get to as many as we can before we close out the session at 12:15 p.m. Eastern Time. We're pleased to be joined today by our good friends, Ambassador Rufus Yerxa, the President of the National Foreign Trade Council, and Wendy Cutler of the Asia Society Policy Institute. You should have received their biographies in the program we sent out earlier today, along with the very distinguished biography of our guest today, Mr. Tuwaijri, the Minister of Economy and Planning of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Thank you for joining us today, Mohammed, and with that, I'll turn it over to Wendy.
Well, thanks, Ken. It's my pleasure to be back here. And really welcome all our guests here for what we hope will be another great program. I thought we would just start with a brief update on what's transpired in Geneva since our webinar last week. We had discussed last week the selection of an interim Director General, and we discussed some of the challenges that Geneva was facing in trying to select someone to fill that position, even for a temporary period of time. Those efforts did not yield success. There is no interim DG, and there was agreement that the current 4 deputy director generals would continue to be responsible for their areas of responsibilities. Geneva is trying to, I think, downplay the significance of this, but I think it's hard not to conclude that this is a setback for the WTO and underscores the serious divisions between members. And it's not just limited to substance, it's also limited to process. We're now in the 2nd month of the phase of the DG selection process, where candidates are going around the world and in Geneva and through webinars and through virtual meetings to introduce themselves and to make the case for their candidacy. This time frame, this phase of the selection process will end on September 7th. And that then is going to start a new phase where efforts will be made to reduce and narrow this slate of candidates. And I thought here it'd be useful to turn it over to Rufus to kind of give us some insights into that process. I would just say there are a number of words that we're hearing a lot about, confessionals and troika, and other terms. So perhaps you can kind of describe this to us, the process, Rufus, and where we hope to end up on November 7th.
Yes, well, thank you, Wendy and Mr. Minister. Mohammed, it's good to see you, and thank you for joining us. Look forward to hearing your comments. I'll be as brief as I can. As Wendy said, the DDG interim appointment didn't go as planned. We'll see how much of a problem that is. I think the WTO Secretary can probably limp along during an interim period as long as there is ultimately a DG in sight. But as Wendy said, it's not a good sign for the future in terms of just how much discord there is among the membership. But the one piece of good news, Wendy, is, the selection process itself for the DG is now pretty much cleared to go according to the way it's gone the last 2 times. So I want everybody to realize this confessional process, which will start on September 7th, it does involve these 3 key officials. They call it the Troika, but it's really David Walker, the chair of the General Council, Ambassador Dacio Castillo of Honduras, who's the chair of the dispute settlement body, and Ambassador Aseland of Iceland, who is the chair of the TPRM. And those 3 will hold basically a 3-round confessional. The first round will go from 8 candidates to 5, the second from 5 to 2, and then the third round will be the finals between the 2. And those confessionals, first of all, it's important to understand no country has to announce publicly who it's supporting. It may if it wishes, but these are confidential, closed confessionals, and each country comes into the Troika and indicates in each round the 4 candidates that they prefer. So in the first round, they go in, they don't say who they don't prefer, they list their 4 preferences. And they can't list them in order, they just list 4. And then out of that, the Troika will come back to the General Council after they've met with everyone and gotten their preferences. And based on a compilation, they'll determine which 3 candidates are the least likely to attract consensus out of that first round. And they will propose that those 3 be dropped. And then it would be expected that those candidates would drop out, that their governments would withdraw them. And then in the second round, they will go to 5. So, and then they'll do the same thing again, list your top 4, in which case they'll come back and indicate who is least likely to gain consensus. So the Troika never comes back to the membership to say which candidate is likely to have the consensus until the very end of the process. In those interim stages, they're simply recommending who doesn't have sufficient support. So this will be a very interesting thing. There's a lot of speculation as to who will drop out. We really don't know, but that's part of why this initial period is so important, where candidates like you, Mohammed, are making yourselves known to the ministers and to the membership. And of course, you've done your session in Geneva. And we hope this is a helpful part of that process for you.
Well, great, thank you. And let's now get the substance of our program started. We're thrilled to have today Minister Mohammed Tuwaijri joining us. As Ken mentioned, it's the 5th DG candidate we're interviewing. And I thought we'd just start off, and I could just ask you if you could share with us, Mohammed, kind of your views on the WTO, your vision for the WTO, how you would approach the job if you were selected, and what experiences and skills would you bring to the job? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all. Before I start, I just hope that everybody is safe and healthy in this unprecedented times that's impacting all of us. So let me start by saying that, my mindset around the approach, the job, what needs to be done is around practicality. I think COVID-19 accompanied with the huge level of uncertainty, volatility in the market prior to that, and what is the aftermath and when it happens of COVID-19 will definitely change the landscape, and the impact on trade is going to be significant. So my approach, if we really want to think about this external environment, we should really come with a fresh mindset around what needs to be done. So in a practical way, that's one. Second, I've looked at every proposal, piece of idea, or an idea around the WTO from members, from thought leaders, from subject matter experts, and everybody is saying this needs a reform and needs a reform now. So my second idea of the approach is the question of how. Absolutely, reform is a big word, and I've done few of them in my life. The recent major reform I've delivered and executed as Minister of Economy and Planning in the Kingdom, I was given a portfolio that is very fluid, making sure to achieve specific targets, economic diversification, sustainable job creation, connecting 3 continents, growth that is diversified in terms of oil, non-oil, very ambitious targets. And I've inherited an entity who was completely away from being able to deliver this. And I was given 4 years to do it, May 16 to May 2020. I've actually delivered by March 2020. So the organization now is more agile, fit. I've created 9 deputyships focused on those objectives. I've built a culture of talents and how they actually can deliver in an institutional way. And in the middle of all of that, I found myself always the person that's neutral, because there is always multiple priorities and interfering priorities with regions, ministers, sectors. So I've always seen myself as someone who's in between, bringing back people to this North Star and direction to make sure progress is always achieved and delivery is what's on the table. Previously also, I've done 25 years in the private sector. All of this career is in global banking. My last job was Chief Executive Officer of a very complex region, Middle East, Africa, and Turkey. And again, the mandate was to rationalize a large portfolio based on very specific criteria, at the same time build new functions and think of profitability and think of sustainability all the time. Trade was core to that too. Again, given 5 years to deliver this mandate, I delivered in 6, simply because there was a lot of headwinds in the financial sector, and dealing with around 32 regulators, things were slower than what I can control. So again, bringing a hybrid mix of this private sector depth, policy making, and delivery of a major transformation in a G20 country is, I think, what really the WTO needs at this point of time. It needs to basically change the mindset of being relatively slow, things are not moving very fast, into a performance and delivery culture. So that's my approach to the WTO at this point of time. I also do realize that the design is not functioning, whether it's the negotiation process, the dispute settlement, notification and monitoring. And that's why people are now lacking trust and confidence in the organization and looking outside for solutions. But I also do respect, this is a member-driven organization, consensus, multilateral trading systems, rule-based is a journey. It's really something in this current environment very challenging to achieve. So again, my mindset is, what kind of change do we need and how are we going to deliver this change? And I'm really willing to press the button and run the extra mile, because I think unless we have a fresh mindset, it's going to be very difficult for anybody to make an impact for the organization to be fit for the 21st century. I also do realize that there is the business as usual. I think this continuous daily follow-up progress, reaching out to capitals with an agenda, with an agreed outcome, and bringing back this to the negotiation table in Geneva, connect ambassadors with their ministers in capitals, and continuously do that all the time is very, very important. So business as usual, protected. The Director General Office, I think, can add a significant value if we shift the mindset into delivery, performance, and solution-oriented, whether it's technical assistance, whether it's process, whether it is understanding the rules in a better way and leave no gap for interpretation as much as possible. But at the same time, the Director General Office, in my mind, need to do more continuously, all the time, but measured. And impact analysis is always very important. That's the second point. Third point, I think the pandemic is definitely impacting everybody. I know there has been a lot of stimulus packages around the world. I've designed one myself. The question is, how is delivered? Is it enough? Do we need to do more? So for businesses, and the business community in general, this uncertainty, unpredictability is going to hurt trade significantly. So the more we give trust and predictability through transparency, through a lot of engagement, even with other international institutions, I think the integrated solution I like to bring to the table, including a deep dive MRI, the first thing I will do is very important to assess where is the problem, what's need to be done, and consult with members to make sure that there is progress, even if it's gradual. But the objective is to really go back to the trust and confidence of the organization. Thank you. Happy to take questions now.
Well, thank you very much. And let me start. It certainly sounds like you would like to bring in a fresh perspective, very practical, but also it seems to me kind of very business oriented, looking at objectives and delivery and performance indicators. I guess my question for you is that a lot of the challenges in the WTO also have to do with the lack of political will and deep divisions among the members on issues, as well as kind of different philosophies on, on the appropriate economic system. So how would you incorporate these challenges as you would try to run more practically the WTO?
It's actually more severe than what you have just explained. I think the relevance of the organization itself is on stake. And whether you need a new setup of rules considering the external environment and the internal disputes and their significance to the organization. So my approach is definitely going to be balanced. I am saying practicality and delivery and performance is needed at this point of time, but at the same time, you have to respect this is a member-driven. Political reach to me is the following. When I want to go and see capitals and Minister of Trade and decision makers, I want to go with a very specific agenda and do this as much as possible. This is not about a prestige. This is not about ticking a box. This is not about going for the sake of going. This is about why I am seeing people in capitals and what are the views of members. How can I convey those views to the decision makers in a holistic point of view? I give you an example, COVID-19. We need to make sure that the organization is the authority and need to make sure that the analysis with scenarios, with a lot of depth, combined with, a holistic view or an integrated view from other worlds, the labor, the financials, is presented to the decision makers. And when that's done, then we bring it back to the negotiation table. So I like to be the guy who connects those dots all the time, progress all the time, not just visit and for the sake of visit. So I do understand the political nature of the beast. It's huge. And maybe even when we look at the core and root causes of all the problems, probably some of them are political. So my job is to eliminate everything else. If it's technical, we should eliminate it. If it's a lack of process or weak process, we should eliminate it. So we can know 100% it's political, and then use the Director General office, ability to negotiate, ability to convince, ability to draw pictures with capitals to help and assist.
So Wendy, if I could follow up on your question, I very much agree with what Wendy said about political will, and political will is a byproduct of whether some of the major governments are really committed to making a process work. So I wanted to ask you a follow-up question on your points about a reform agenda, because can you actually have even a successful launch of a reform agenda if some of the key players, the leadership, the political leadership, particularly in Beijing and Washington and Brussels, aren't committed to helping you make it work? They may ultimately at the end disagree on elements of that, but if they aren't if there's not buy-in from the beginning, can it ever really work? So I guess I'd ask you the question of, what do you see as sort of in your first, 6 months as DG, how do you get them to buy into supporting an effort with that kind of buy-in?
So look, prior to this nomination, I've worked very closely with the G20 agenda, basically to achieve that political support to the WTO. And one of the Riyadh track is, addressing the necessary reforms needed. And we can bring a lot of that to the table because, the leaders, seems to me at this stage, they're supportive of the reforms. They have different views around the how, different views around the, when, and some of it are a bit extreme. But again, I think coming from a developing country, a G20 member, and I've always been engaged in these dialogues, is very important. So there is a prerequisite here. I think that's available. Second, you asked me about 6 months. I think 6 months is a bit long time. We should know in the first probably 2 to 3 months whether the intention is to support a reform or not. What I'll do, I will basically reach out with a very specific mandate, very specific. I say, these are the top 5 questions. Tell me what you think, and then tell me what you don't like. So that kind of dialogue, do I have the access to reach out to the US, China, and the EU? Absolutely. And, coming from where I'm coming from, I think that's one privilege I have to really reach out, because we've always been a neutral country, and we have great trade relationships with the rest of the world, and the G20 agenda. So it is how you are going to approach those decision makers. What is the information you're going to give? Holistic enough, and understanding the scenarios, the impact. If, in my mind, if the leadership understood what COVID-19 is doing to the least developing countries, and how will that impact job creation, sustainability, the environment, and quantified, I think the argument is moving from no or very, strict view to the how. And what is it that you can give and take? Where is the line we can draw? And then conveying those views regularly, all the time. And of course, use every resource available in the organization to help with that.
Perhaps I can move on to a different area, and that's the area of China. Ambassador Lighthizer, when asked what criteria he'd be looking for in supporting a director general, he mentioned that he'd be seeking someone who understands that the current WTO rules don't discipline China. Do you agree with that? And furthermore, would you support efforts, particularly with respect to industrial subsidies, to reform and to really strengthen the current WTO rules?
I support effort to go back to negotiation in the member-driven organization. I support effort to make progress. I was very proud to see phase 1 between the US and China, through negotiation. I support effort, how can we build on that? At the same time, I think also China is a big country. It's a big trading partner for everybody. I go back to the need to reform and need to understand flexibilities given to developing countries. How do we quantify them? What's the impact of these flexibilities on other countries? So my role as DG is to make sure the progress, the reform is back into the negotiation, which is not working today effectively. So I think the more we do of promoting the negotiation in an enhanced process, have some measures around it. If people agree to stay for 5 years, negotiation a topic, do members really think 5 years is the right time? Or we can narrow that based on very specific, negotiated, agreed objectives that it should be 1 year. This is just a little example of what the process can be improved, and then bring all the issues that's on the table, China, US, but there are many others, frankly speaking. My objective is to make sure the negotiation process, which is the root cause of so many problems, is enhanced enough and improved enough so that people can go back to it again.
Let me, Wendy, if I could just turn it to Mohammed, ask you a little bit about dispute settlement, because you mentioned it earlier, and I'm just trying to gauge what importance you place to that. You've talked a lot about reform, but obviously there's also this issue of making the current dispute process work and overcoming the difficulties with the appellate body that have paralyzed the system. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. And I guess my basic question is, do you feel that that needs to be done as a kind of a conditioned precedent to getting the agenda for reform going, or does it happen simultaneously with a reform agenda? How urgently do you think we need to fix dispute settlement?
Look, again, if the Director General himself have no direct influence on the dispute settlement, I do respect and understand that. But the question is there a procedural challenge in the process that the Director General can help and influence? Is there an interpretation challenge of the laws? People are deviating so much. Is there something we can do to make sure the interpretation is enhanced? Yes, then I think we can deliver and help. But there has been also a lot of ideas and solutions. The European have made a temporary idea around the disputes settlement. David Walker himself put a full paper around it about a year ago. I've looked at that, but the question is why it's not happening. So I go back to the same logic. I think we should go back to the negotiation and fix that so we don't have more issues in the future, and then demonstrate that things can be resolved there with a lot of early warning signs rather than go to disputes. When it comes to the current crisis of the dispute body, I think this is up to members. They want to change rules. Members should be deciding that. Now, as a trusted, honest, neutral person who work with them, I think I will do my best to really stimulate thinking, to really stimulate mindset, and bring like-minded ideas into the table and try to really encourage the organization to think differently about it. But if it's procedural, if it's interpretation, I think absolutely we can help, but the rest is really up to the members to decide what to do.
I noticed in your formal statement to the WTO a few weeks ago, you called for annual ministerial meetings of the WTO members. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you were saying it wasn't really necessary to have deliverables at each of these sessions, but it was a great opportunity for ministers to get together and get engaged on this agenda. But I'm hearing today someone who's really results oriented. So I guess my question for you, can you explain why you would like to increase the frequency of ministers' meetings? And do you think that is a useful tool in delivering results?
Yeah, no, look, first of all, I think the environment is changing and changing very rapidly. I will say by weeks even, not years. So if we want to really have an organization that's connected to reality, I think an annual conference is very sensible. But that's not my challenge. This is not the biggest challenge. I think ministers will welcome that if we really go to them with a very clear agenda. And I've listened carefully the last few weeks. People are saying we go to these conferences, deliver a statement, and go back home. I'll be very frank with you. And this is not right. The challenge is significant. The relevance of the organization is on stake, and issues are not moving. And this is the ultimate body who should think, oh, how would e-trade and e-commerce change the landscape? I also like them in these conferences to hear from the private sector, from subject matter experts, from think tank. We should ask questions about, this is how the world is thinking about you. So give it a lot of flavor and then trigger this thinking. And also there's a lot of preparation. I think 1 year is a lot of time for the ministerial conference to get prepared. And then what is the outcome? How do we measure it, communicate it, and bring it back to the negotiation table? So yes, I am very keen to encourage members to meet at least once a year, but with a very structured program to achieve results.
Wendy, one more from me, and that'll do it for me. But I wanted to ask about the post-COVID environment from your perspective. I mean, we all know that you've been involved with the G20, and you know that even during COVID, there's been a lot of pressure from governments to take things like export restrictions in an effort to encourage their own self-sufficiency, which can end up being counterproductive if you really need international cooperation to tackle a challenge like COVID. But in the post-pandemic area, we may even see more of this in the form of protectionist pressures, subsidy practices, non-tariff barriers, tariff increases, other things. How important do you think the WTO's role is in that period, and what would you do? In other words, I'm thinking of the monitoring and oversight that went on in the wake of the financial crisis that was initiated in the WTO. Would you try the same sort of thing in this environment?
Look, it's very hard to see the post-COVID-19 in totality and understanding the full impact now. Let's be also practical about it. So what I would like to do is to really measure and understand and quantify the impact for everybody. And I think this is an opportunity, because even the initiation of the WTO itself and GATT before was based on a major need. People needed a body that basically governs and monitor everything. I think now we've been in many ways, there is a great opportunity with COVID-19 to rethink and reassess everything we're talking about. Do we go back to the original goals, and how? What is the impact of COVID-19 on each country and on the global trade itself? How will the e-commerce that's evolving, we're talking about healthcare supplies, food security at this point of time. And in many ways, look, as a fellow citizen now, as someone who's in charge of policy, I understood when people got the shock of COVID-19, the first reaction is to protect their citizens and to protect their economies. So that's understood. But the question is, when this is over, we should think, how is this an opportunity for us to think again about the importance of, trade and its impact on people's lives and on costs and on corporates and on the whole value chain of trade. So I will definitely approach it scientifically, but this is the process we need to improve as well. What is the readiness of the organization in case something like this happens in 10 years' time? What I'd like to leave behind is an organization that's dynamic enough, fit enough, strong enough, ready enough. I would have assumed, honestly, that somewhere 5 years ago, there is a scenario of a pandemic within the WTO. And then this was communicated. This is my assumption. That's what I did in the ministry. Now, in the ministry now, we give 3-year plan to the private sector. We give them the budget 3 years ahead. So they can plan, they can predict, they can design their issues and challenges accordingly. So the more we give information, the more the organization is dedicated and fit and can really provide the right information, the better.
Maybe I can ask you about your views on plurilaterals. More and more we see subsets of WTO countries coming together to work on issues. How do you view them? Because on one hand, I've noticed that you've underscored the importance of inclusiveness. Do you see plurilaterals as a good practical alternative? And do you think there are certain features of plurilaterals that need to be considered going forward?
The short answer is yes. And I think, from a practical point of view, people need to move on. And these plurilateral solutions are part of the solutions, but there are questions in my mind. Some of the plurilaterals are there, and on a most favored nations, people can join, but they don't. So I want to ask why. I want to really go and see the root cause why people are either blocking or not joining. Is it political? Is it technical? And go back to the same discipline around, how can we make this more effective? Now, if the number of plurilateral is very large and the journey toward multilateral is now less and less, then there is a question mark. The question is frequency, to what and who and why people are joining or not joining, who's blocking, technical, political. So as a solution, yes, because it's available and some of it is really good. And I've seen some of the ideas on the table. I think it's a way toward the multilateral trading ultimately.
Ken, we can go to you now.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Al-Tuwaijri, for joining us today. We're going to take a couple of questions that we have and remind people who are watching on Zoom, if you want to have any questions and you want to submit them, please use the Q&A tab on Zoom. So one of them, following up on one of the things Wendy just said, she mentioned the phrase inclusive trade. That is also something that has gotten a lot of attention in recent years. The role of women in international trade, and certainly with COVID and the slowdown in global trade, it's impacted a lot of lower income jobs and that women around the world are working on. Are there things that we can be doing with the WTO, if you were the Director General, to address some of the issues, to bring more people into the global trading system and address some of the inequalities in the system?
Absolutely. And I think we go back to the original goals. One of the integrated solution I would like to bring to the table is also tapping into the sustainable development goals of the United Nations, understanding the ESG agenda and how it's impact business. I think the WTO should be central, but very engaged as well. So these issues are very important. I've mentioned earlier on, in the dialogue with capitals, this should be also part of the impact analysis. How do we quantify loss of businesses? What does that mean for job creation and women empowerment and the smaller countries? And, coming from a leadership point of view and, the G20 agendas that we've discussed, I think when people present them in a very scientific, consistent way, people will listen to you. One of the things I've done in Saudi Arabia, I was, vice chairman of our National Development Fund, and one of the funds under this portfolio is the Saudi Fund for Development. The whole purpose of creating this fund was to support countries in need, out of responsibility of a wealthy nation. But when we looked at the deployment of those, there must be also a criteria and objective and why we're doing it and how do we make sure sustainability is there. So there is a balance we should strike at the WTO by connecting, tapping into the shared objectives and measure continuously those issues.
Very good, thank you. A couple of questions have come in. We discussed briefly earlier about the appellate body and the role of the Director General in addressing some of the issues there. But I guess a broader question is, until that issue is addressed, do you think that the WTO will be able to address some of the larger issues that are facing the organization, some of the larger trade round or some of the bigger issues, unless the WTO appellate body issue is not yet resolved?
That's why I said the first action of my agenda is to have a deep MRI, go to the root causes, understand them, consult with all members, and listen to every single piece presented as a solution and plug it into this MRI and then reach out. So this is the first thing I should do. It is fair for members, fair for the future of the organization, and fair for the challenge of the pandemic and the post-pandemic pandemic. So that will be addressed there. And I've talked about possibilities of procedural interpretation, and I know the current situation is very tricky and it's basically stalling, but also we should bring in a real analysis day one to understand the root causes. And I go back to the negotiation, because if negotiation is not fixed, then I can assure you that we will have even bigger issues and more disputes. and larger gaps in the future.
So in following up on that, one of the other issues that have come up is the WTO was not designed to deal with non-market economies, and especially large non-market economies. Is that something that you would see being able to be addressed in a future multilateral negotiation?
Look, my understanding now, if people are following the rules of the WTO and the classification, you have different models around the world, but the question is, how do people follow the rules and what is the level of transparency? So if we achieve those, the Marrakesh Declaration was very clear. It should be, it should be a market-oriented organization. However, I think the focus is on following the rules and being transparent. If we can manage those and fix those and improve those and get to the root causes, as I just said, then people are different. As simple as that.
Very good. So we actually have 3 questions that are very similar that have come in, asking about the process a bit, what you've gone through. Obviously with COVID, it's limited travel. Have you been doing most of your sessions with countries in person, virtually? What have you heard from people in the US government? We know you've met with some people in the administration in this visit. Have you met with members of Congress? As you might know, the US Congress often has a large and loud voice on international trade issues. And actually in the US Constitution, they have the power to regulate foreign commerce. So they do have a role in our process as well. Can you tell us anything about the discussions and the consultation process you've had?
Look, I'm doing everything I can in this environment. Most of the meetings are virtual, but there has been some physical meetings. I mean, this is something up to the other party to decide, not up to me. I'm available and ready. I've been tested yesterday and I'll be tested again tomorrow. I do every single protocol to make sure this is a healthy process. But my approach is very simple: reach out to most, the business communities, think tanks, decision makers, and being very consistent in this process is key to me. So what I will say now is hopefully what I will say after even I get the job.
We are delighted to hear that. Before we wrap up, Rufus or Wendy, any final questions or thoughts to share?
Oh, just simply to thank you, Mohammed, for being very, very open with us and for giving us a good overview of your candidacy.
Same here. Thank you very much.
Well, we do have actually, sorry, I went for last comment. I didn't know if you had any last questions. We do have a couple others that have come in. Just last little final comments, if you would. One is on the issue of digital taxation. It's an issue the OECD is directly addressing, not something that's directly WTO, but there is a nexus to international trade, and there's some trade disputes that might come from that. Just thoughts on the digital tax issues. And then and the last one was on, there was a US, Japan, EU trilateral proposal on industrial subsidies and technology transfer. Have you given any thought to any of those issues?
Well, digital taxation negotiation. We should go back to the negotiation. This is the forum of, where people should discuss, again, back to the DG rule and to the reform plan, how to enhance this, how to make sure people are fully informed and, the decision can be made there. On the US, EU, Japan idea, any idea is welcome. I think, again, if we can translate this idea and interpret it in a way that all members can see it holistically and see the benefit out of it, I think, any idea is really welcome.
Well, thank you very much. We are very grateful for your time. We wish you the best of luck in your candidacy, in your travels. We hope you are safe and your family is safe. Everybody who's watching, thank you for joining us today. We hope you'll join us tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern, when we'll be having a discussion with the Kenyan candidate, Amina Mohammed. And next Tuesday at 8:30 in the morning, US Eastern time, with the Korean candidate to be Director General. Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you for joining us. Best of luck, safe travels, and everybody out there, wear a mask. Thank you.
Thank you.